Hello, and welcome to this ADB seminar, Adaptive Social Protection, Looking Ahead in Asia and the Pacific. I'm Babkin Babajanyan, and I'm a Senior Social Protection Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. Today's webinar is part of the webinar series hosted by ADB, and they're entitled Rethinking Social Protection, Inclusive, Adaptive, and Future-Ready Systems. This series explores the current state and evolving landscape of social protection in Asia and the Pacific. They focus on the sessions we support focus both on innovations and the challenges social protection systems face in the region, and also aim to share practical ideas and solutions. We aim to explore how social protection systems are adapting to new and emerging challenges, and the strategies, approaches, policies used by governments and other actors to make them stronger and more effective. For example, in the previous webinars, we explored the role of social protection in enhancing nutrition. We also focus on the usage of data in assessing inclusiveness and comprehensiveness of social protection. I should also mention that this series is part of the offerings of the Asia Pacific online community, which is a forum that you can join for interaction, exchange of ideas, knowledge sharing, and you would also receive bi-monthly digests of key publications and resources on social protection in the region. You can join this community by clicking the arrow on this slide. I encourage everyone to join. It's a great forum, and we encourage people to share ideas and contribute to the exchange there. At the moment, we have 253 members, and the community is growing. Now, today's session, which is session 3 of the webinar series, focuses on adaptive social protection. Our aim is to draw on examples and lessons from the region and explore how social protection can promote climate resilience and resilience more broadly in the face of uncertainty that countries in the region face. And the specific focus is obviously on the marginalized individuals, households, and communities, those who are hard to reach, and the importance of enabling social protection to not only promote resilience, but also to reach out to those who are particularly vulnerable and marginalized. So let me talk a little bit about the housekeeping matters. The session is being recorded. So along with the presentation, it will be available on socialprotection.org to all those who have registered, and it will be there after this session. When you would like to interact with others, please use the chat box to introduce yourselves, make comments, or share any links that you think are useful for the community who is part of the webinar today. But when you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box. And when asking your question, we would appreciate if you could state your name, your organization, but also direct your question to a particular speaker so that they know, so we know whom to direct your question and who should answer your question. And also, it would be helpful if you mention specific point or statement that your question is specifically associated with. Finally, the Zoom AI generates automatic captions, and if you'd like to view the captions, you can click the CC closed captions button. So that's all on the session's essentials. And the session flow is as follows. So we allocated about 20 minutes for the main presentation, and this is to be followed by a panel discussion and a 20-minute Q&A. We encourage everyone to ask questions and to actively participate in this webinar. Now, with this, I would like to introduce our team today, who are here to share their thoughts with you. So our main presenter is Christy Lowe. She's adaptive social protection expert. She's an ADB consultant and ODI research associate. Our panel moderator today is Rosie Bright. She's a social protection advisor at the World Food Programme based in Rome. Now, our panelists today are Mr. Abdul Hanif Chachar, who's the Deputy Secretary, the Ministry of Poverty Alleviation and Social Safety of Pakistan. Ms. Imee Rose C. Castillo, Officer in Charge at the Preparedness for Response Division, the Disaster Response Management Bureau of the Department of Social Welfare and Development in the Philippines. And Mr. Nard Huijbregts, Lead Social Policy Advisor at the Economic Policy Research Institute, otherwise known as EPRI. So with this, I'm now handing over to Christy Lowe for the main presentation. And I would like also to note that this presentation, this work that Christy will be presenting is really a practical conceptual framework that outlines policies, programs, and systems that can be designed and redesigned to help social protection to promote resilience in Asia and the Pacific. This work has been supported by an ADB technical assistance and funded through a Community Resilience Partnership Programs Trust Fund, otherwise known as CRPP. So with this, I'm handing over to Christy. Over to you, Christy.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you everyone for joining. It's wonderful to have so many of you on the webinar. I am just hopefully getting my screen set up here. Let me just see if I can get it in presentation mode. Can someone just let me know if that's sharing okay?
Yes, sharing okay.
Great. Okay, so yes, I'm going to dive right in because we don't have too long and there's quite a lot to cover, and I of course want to leave time for the interesting panel discussion and audience questions and comments as well. I don't think that I need to go into really much of the context here. Unfortunately, we've had very sad reminders of this even just in the last few weeks, but it is worth noting that Asia and the Pacific is the most disaster-prone region in the world, and it is also very clearly affected by the slow onset, kind of gradual impacts of climate change as well. So those rising temperatures, rising sea temperatures, glacier melt, and so on. So this is the context we're working with, and this means that obviously climate risks are of increasing concern to social protection actors, and that has given rise to the emergence of this concept of adaptive social protection, which is basically about the integration of social protection with disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. So basically the orange segment that you can see on that Venn diagram in the middle. But I think it is helpful. Many of you may be familiar also with the term shock responsive social protection. So it can be helpful to clarify how we are viewing this. We see shock responsive social protection as the subset of adaptive social protection that's focusing on integrating social protection with disaster risk management specifically, so less concerned with maybe the longer term climate change adaptation considerations, which is covered in adaptive social protection as a whole. Obviously, these terms do vary by country, we recognise that, but just to clarify how we have conceptualised it in our framework. But what is really the point of these linkages? Why would we be integrating these areas? Well, for us, it's really all about this concept of resilience and how to build the resilience of populations, but especially the resilience of the poorest and most vulnerable households and individuals who we know are the worst affected by these disasters and by the impacts of climate change. But then that begs the question, what is resilience and how can adaptive social protection help to build it? Well, for this part of the framework, we've borrowed and built on the ideas of Aditya Bahadur and others from the BRACED program at ODI, a framework that they developed 10 years ago called the 3A's framework. And that basically defines resilience as having three capacities, these 3A's. So the capacity to anticipate, absorb, and adapt in the longer term to different shocks and stresses. And therefore, adaptive social protection is about helping people or supporting people to develop these capacities. So basically, in the first A, supporting people to be able to anticipate and reduce the impact of a hazard by taking actions to prepare and plan before a specific hazard occurs. So it's the time sequence that we're interested in that distinguishes the first A from the second A, absorb, which is about supporting people to absorb and cope with the impacts of a hazard after it already has hit. So when it occurs and during and after the shock's occurrence. And then the third A, adapt, is about supporting people to adapt to multiple longer-term future risks by learning and adjusting after each disaster and thereby breaking out of kind of risk traps and recurring cycles of vulnerability. So those are the 3A's, but the framework also recognises that vulnerability to disasters and climate change is not random. It exacerbates existing socioeconomic vulnerability. And also these are complex areas that are all interlinked. You cannot just work in an isolated way on a specific dimension. So in order to effectively build resilience, you do need to be thinking about broader systems and societal transformation. To go beyond incremental changes and see a more fundamental shift in approach. And that includes trying to work on addressing the kind of unequal power relations and underlying drivers of poverty and marginalization, which make certain members of the population much more vulnerable to climate extremes and disasters. I've particularly put this on here because I think many of you will recognize that actually addressing inequality, poverty, marginalization is, of course, the core function of a social protection system. That's very much what social protection is designed to try to do. And so I think it's worth remembering that adaptive social protection involves taking targeted action to address these 3A's, but that needs to be kind of in addition to the crucial continuous role that routine social protection should be playing in addressing poverty, marginalization, and inequality. Okay, so when it comes to these kind of targeted actions of adaptive social protection to address these 3A's, how would we actually go about integrating that into a social protection system? How would we bring in these adaptive measures? Well, in this part of the framework, we are building on work of the International Institute of Environment and Development, IIED, who have thought about this in terms of three kind of domains. So they have thought about the adaptive measures needed at the policy level to kind of adjust policies so that they actually acknowledge climate-related risks and outline climate resilience objectives, but also the types of programs that need to be in place to support climate resilience of vulnerable populations. And on this, I think it's worth mentioning here that adaptive social protection programs won't necessarily all be kind of purely social protection agency-led, social protection ministry-led. This is about linking sectors. So some of these programs will be led by other agencies and ministries, but it's about how they are all linked together in a comprehensive system. And then the third domain relates really to the operational considerations. So what kinds of institutional coordination, financing mechanisms, the technology, the infrastructure and administrative mechanisms that need to be in place to actually operationalize the adaptive social protection policies and programs that we just discussed. And in our work on developing this conceptual framework, we've actually gone through and looked at each of these levels to think about what are the adjustments that need to be made and the provisions that need to be developed to build, to address each of these 3As and to support people with each of these 3As. I won't have time today to go into all of that level of detail, but it is very much thinking that has built on existing literature, the very hard work of many researchers and policymakers and practitioners, some of whom may be on this call. So wanting to acknowledge them, of course, as well. But just to kind of skim through some of the thinking at the policy level, when we think about kind of the progress and the gaps, and looking ahead to try and strengthen this area, I would say that over the last decade, and particularly since the COVID-19 crisis, there has been growing recognition of the need to adjust social protection policies so that they provide better support in the face of large-scale shocks. So this is the kind of absorb function. Basically, we've seen a kind of a flurry of shock responsive social protection policies. And those policies, when they are good policies, they are including provisions that relate both to maintaining routine provision when a shock occurs, but also expanding provision to be able to meet emergency needs. In relatively fewer cases have we seen examples of policies being developed to promote proactive support for the population before a shock occurs. That would be the kind of anticipatory social protection policies. And these would cover both the kind of general disaster risk reduction measures, but also importantly, social protection has a big role to play in enabling anticipatory action and anticipatory assistance, which is the assistance that's triggered when a shock is forecast but has not yet actually hit, or it has not reached its peak. So those policies are not so common yet. And then I would say in fewer cases still, countries are starting to develop kind of truly adaptive social protection policies in terms of systematically bringing together the social protection, disaster risk management, and long-term climate adaptation measures, and integrating with long-term climate action plans. And I think to give a country example of this kind of trajectory, there's a nice case from Bangladesh where they actually, really from the outset of their social protection system, they've had a shock responsive system because it was kind of born out of disaster response. So the National Social Security Strategy has a very clear focus, or it includes a focus on mitigating covariate large-scale risks and shocks. But more recently, they've also been developing provisions. So in the disaster management policy, there are provisions in place for what they call forecast-based action, or kind of anticipatory action. And they've developed policies in that space that actually specify the role that social safety net programs should be playing in the delivery of anticipatory assistance. And that's been a more recent development. And then also in 2023, they released their strategic guidelines for adaptive social protection, and that is very much about bringing in the long-term climate change adaptation considerations as well. And you see it, sorry, I skipped forward there, but you see it in the other way around too, where the National Climate Adaptation Plan does also clearly reference social safety nets. So it's kind of working in both directions, that policy integration. Let me move on then to the program level, and this is the one that I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time on. Here again, we've seen the bulk of the adaptive social protection programming has really related to the absorb function. So that the kind of shock responsive social protection programming, I think it will be familiar as a concept to quite a lot of you on the call. And in our framework, we tried to distinguish here between two types of shock responsive social protection programming. So one of them being almost like the regular or it kind of part of the routine system in some ways. The programs that actually they do have a budget already there. They have they are a fixed kind of feature in the system and in policy. They may not operate year round, but they are there, and they're designed to be able to support populations in the face of kind of somewhat regular shocks. So especially seasonal shocks. And I don't have time to go into the detail, but you can see here that there are examples of this across the social protection system. So social assistance programs, but also insurance and labour market policies that are trying to address shocks caused by, for example, the lean season in the agricultural kind of off season, or winter or summer, extreme heat, certain regulations that are in place to protect workers during the extremes of summer. So it's kind of instruments across the board being used here for these types of seasonal shocks. But then there's also the shock responsive programming that's really additional, the expansion of the system temporarily when ad hoc emergencies occur. And of course, the biggest example of this in history comes from the COVID-19 response, when many different social protection instruments were being used in countries in the region and globally to address that unexpected emergency. Now, I know I'm going through this quite quickly, but I just want to make sure we cover everything in the initial slot, at least at a high level. I think it's worth spending a bit of time on the second second slide of the programming section, anticipate, because anticipatory programming is not something that many governments in the region have been able to develop too much yet, and there are often more examples on kind of NGO and UN side, or in the pure disaster response space, but not necessarily linking to the social protection system. So what kind of role could the social protection system be playing in supporting vulnerable populations before the shock hits? Well, in our framework here, we tried to separate a bit between the kind of general disaster preparedness measures. So the top two on the trio, the middle column here. These are roles that social protection can support with disaster risk reduction training, information, and also physical preparation. So to give you an example from the Philippines, in the Philippines, the flagship conditional cash transfer program, the 4Ps program, has family development sessions that are required participation of all recipients. And one of the modules within those family development sessions is about disaster preparedness and response. But the Philippines also has examples of public works projects that are actually focused on trying to strengthen preparedness for disasters. So, for example, a Cash for Work program that has focus on climate change adaptation and mitigation, and that can be, the activities then that public works participants are involved in can be things like strengthening embankments, or dredging rivers, or unclogging canal access, which obviously helps with preparedness for when floods do occur or disasters do hit. And then there's a big category of anticipatory programming that relates to distributing assistance to households when a specific shock has been forecast, but before it actually reaches its peak. And the assistance can be quite wide-ranging. I'm not going to talk about this in detail because we're very fortunate to have a representative from the Philippines, Imee, who's going to, I believe, touch a little bit on their anticipatory assistance programming. But that is a kind of leading example in the region from a government programming perspective, with the support of other agencies, of course. And then the third A is this long-term climate adaptation objective. And here, social protection, again, can play various different roles, and we try and think of a kind of typology. We break it down into two different main functions that social protection can support. So one is supporting people to adapt their physical living environment, the kind of location where they live, to be more prepared for climate change. And the other is about adapting their livelihoods and income and food security strategies to prepare for the impacts of climate change. Under the first category, living environments, again, we thought that there are a lot of different ways of categorizing this, but we've kind of focused especially on two social protection instruments, one of them being green public works programs. And there are quite a few examples around the region of public works programs actually employing participants on a kind of daily wage model, usually, to conserve or better manage natural resources like local forests. The example I've put on the screen there is from the Sindh province in Pakistan. The Delta Blue Capital project is actually the world's largest mangrove restoration project. And that one operates on a green public works model. There's also cases of public works programs helping to build climate resilient infrastructure. And I put in India's NREGA program on the screen. That's obviously one of the best known and longest standing public works programs in the region and in the world as well. And that program works both on promoting natural resource management, but also building resilient infrastructure. And in its 20-year lifespan, it's built hundreds of thousands of kilometers of what they call all-weather rural roads. So those kind of resilient road systems. Then when we think about another social protection instrument, the subsidies category, I think it can be helpful to think about the role that subsidies can be playing in supporting families and communities to upgrade their housing to become more resilient, for example, more flood resistant. But we can also think about the programs that need to be in place in the cases where actually it's no longer viable for communities to continue residing in the neighborhood where they live, that actually the impacts of climate change are projected to be so bad in that area, for example, rising sea levels, that those locations will become uninhabitable. And so there's a very interesting example from Fiji of how they are working on the planned relocation of those communities and the role of social protection in supporting that transition. When it comes to adapting livelihoods, I've kind of cheated a little bit here because basically there's kind of a catch-all category of sustainable livelihoods programming, which includes many of the components that are featured in the oval that you can see on the screen there. And these I think the key point to make here is that these programs can be run through the social protection systems. So we're going to hear later about an example from Pakistan of the National Poverty Graduation Program that has climate resilience as an objective and features multiple of the boxes that you can see in that oval. But you can also have sustainable livelihoods programming that's run by other ministries or agencies. So I've put the same Sindh Pakistan Delta Blue Capital project as an example there, because that's actually led by the Sindh Forest Department, but it does include, for example, training on climate resilient livelihoods for the participants in that project. And I won't go into, I'll resist the urge to go into further detail, but we can discuss more in the Q&A this category. Then
Christy,
I also at the bottom.
Sorry
Yes.
to interrupt you, but I think we're at 20 minutes, so just a reminder of the timing, and maybe if you could take 1 or 2 minutes to wrap up, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the final category on this adaptation point relates to 2 other instruments that can be used. So payments for ecosystem services, environmental cash transfers is another instrument that some of you may have heard about, but this is kind of compensating people to halt unsustainable practices and to convert to more sustainable ways of interacting with natural resources. But there's also active labour market programs that do need to play a big role in the just transition, in the transition to a green economy through job matching services, skills training and other functions. And China has a very interesting example that I don't think I have time to go into to here, but when we are publishing our paper, we'll discuss that more. And I just wanted to recognize here, our focus has been on the adaptation side, but in the climate sphere, there's also a big focus on how we can actually not just adapt to climate change, but try to slow down the pace of global warming. And it's worth noting, I've highlighted in yellow, the fact that several of the social protection programs that were just discussed on the previous slide actually can play very important roles too in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and addressing this climate mitigation point. So, for example, the mangrove restoration project that I mentioned in Sindh is actually projected to sequester 142 million tons of carbon dioxide during its 60-year lifespan. So it's a very significant contributor to climate mitigation efforts in that province. I don't want to take away too much time from the panelists, so I'm just going to, in any case, this was not going to be a category that I would present in detail today, but I just wanted to put up this slide on systems to show you that there are actually, this is the kind of operational adjustments that can be made to institutional coordination, financing mechanisms, information systems, technology, and so on, to help prepare for each of the 3A's programming. So this, I think, is going really into the nitty-gritty, but it is something that we recognise that actually policymakers and practitioners, of course, need this kind of level of thinking in order to actually put ASP into practice. So I will leave this. Well, no, I think I'll stop screen sharing there, and look forward to hearing from the panelists and going into more of the discussion in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christy. I'm having problems with my video, but I'll get it on as soon as I can. That was incredibly rich and such a good scene setter in terms of, you know, the full breadth and complexity that we're often referring to under the heading of adaptive social protection. I really liked in particular the example you gave from Bangladesh in terms of kind of looking at that evolution from the policy perspective on how they have been able to work through those 3A's. And yeah, as you say, the kind of the rubber hits the road on the system features, and hopefully, although we couldn't spend too much time on that in the presentation because of time, we'll be able to get into that more fully as we move in to the panel discussion. So firstly, a huge thank you to SP.org and ADB for the invitation to be here today. I think it's a really important conversation, and honoured to be here with kind of distinguished guests who can talk us through some examples that will help us all further unpack this topic of adaptive social protection. So our discussants have already been introduced, but just as a reminder, we have Mr. Abdul Hanif Chachar from Pakistan, Ms. Imee Rose Castillo from Philippines, and we're also benefiting from Nard's perspectives from EPRI in this section. The idea, also as a reminder, is we'll spend about 40 minutes going through a bit of an exchange, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A so that you will all have the chance to also ask your questions. So without further ado, Hanif, if I can turn to you. So Pakistan is already quite well known for its experience using shock responsive social protection to respond to disasters, and the catastrophic 2022 floods are a good example of that, I think. But you also have some interesting examples of social protection programming that aims to build longer term climate resilience, for example, the National Poverty Graduation Programme. this type of long-term climate adaptive social protection is perhaps a little bit more nascent than some of the other areas of adaptive social protection for most countries. So it would be really interesting if we could hear more from you about that experience. So could you please tell us a bit about the climate responsive elements of that program and what were some of the challenges that you've encountered and maybe some of the lessons learned along the way? Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, Pakistan has a robust shock responsive social protection system. Benazir Income Support Program, which is a flagship initiative of the federal government of Pakistan, it supports 10 million households for routine social protections through unconditional cash transfer. It also supports same beneficiaries for conditional cash transfer for education and nutrition and health of same beneficiaries. The program has evolved over the time. It has now moved to digital dynamic registry and has registered more than 90% of the total populations. So, and in case of any disaster, the program can be used for provision of cash transfer to non-beneficiaries in real time within 24 hours through biometric verification systems. It has also introduced saving schemes under the new initiatives. So when the beneficiaries contribute 60%, 40% is shared by contributed by the government. So the saving can be used in case of any disaster. And then we have moved to mobile registry to register, enroll the remote and vulnerable populations. And now coming to NPGP, after realizing and to look at the overall graduation poverty alleviation strategy, the government launched National Poverty Graduation Program with the support of IFAD with a portfolio of $132 million from 2017 to 2025. It was implemented in 21 poor districts based on multidimensional poverty, and program covered more than 370,000 households. The aim was to build on the cash support model of BISP and to help BISP beneficiaries to transit from dependence on government to self-reliance of sustainable livelihood. And another purpose was to reduce the burden on government because cash support for a longer period is not sustainable for a government which is already facing financial constraints. NPGP's unique model is based on a big push theory. It did not offer a single intervention, but it provided a package of support which included more than 5 different components like transfer of productive assets, cattle, livestock, small rickshaws, uh, and hand tractors, and also small shops in intangible asset, vocational training like beautician course, electricians, auto mechanic, and also skill for heavy machinery. So those beneficiaries could earn their livelihood. Uh, in addition to productive asset, it also provided interest-free loans. It also provided livelihood trainings. It created common interest groups so that the beneficiaries could pool in their resources and can better negotiate with the local markets. There were different sessions as well for climate resilience agriculture. There were sessions. Those sessions also included uh, not only beneficiary but the surrounding populations to have a big impact. So there were sessions on digital literacy, skill development. There were sessions on nutrition, food, healthy eating habits. And to specific in climate resilient agriculture, there was awareness session on use of importance of quality seeds, selection of climate resilient crops, and use of avoiding use of excessive pesticide and to better use of right quantity timing of fertilizer and how to cut cost and increase productivity and also to better manage conserve water. So there were third party evaluation conducted by Pakistan Institute of Economics, Development Economics. There were results I can share. The 73% of the population reported adopted climate smart practices due to program. 58% implemented water conservations, and 42% used drought resistance crop. 81% shock preparedness improved, reported. So assets were insured, livestock were vaccinated, and insurance was free and compulsory for 1 year. And the program also showed resilience despite the COVID-19 and floods of 2022. It delivered and completed, achieved its desired results. So thank you from me, my side.
Great, very rich and very good timekeeping as well. Thank you very much. Yeah, package of livelihood intervention sounds very sophisticated. I'm really interested to know more specifically about whether or not you were able to use any sort of longer term climate change forecasting to inform the different packages in different locations, but maybe we'll have time to get into that in the Q&A. So thanks so much. Imee, if I may turn to you now to talk a little bit about what we can learn from the Philippines. So the Philippines has also very much moved beyond basic shock responsive social protection to introduce adaptive social protection programs aimed at supporting longer term climate adaptation, for example, through the project Lowe and Binhi. Can you tell us a bit about how this project aims to support the climate resilience of vulnerable communities? What are some of the difficulties of developing programming that meets social protection and climate adaptation needs simultaneously, in your view? And how have you tried to navigate these issues or trade-offs? Ms. Castillo, can you hear us?
Sorry. Yeah, I hear.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much. So am I audible? So thank you very much. So we have 3 sub-questions. So the first question is, how does this project, the Project Lowe at Binhi, aim to support the climate resilience of vulnerable communities? So, but first let me introduce a short introduction about Lowe at Binhi. Lowe is a Filipino term meaning lagoon or lake. But for the project, it's an acronym that stands for Local Adaptation to Water Access. And Binhi, the seedlings, stands for Breaking Insufficiency through Nutritious Harvest for the Impoverished. It's a Philippine government initiative under the Risk Resiliency Program. Project Lowe and Binhi supports climate resilience by integrating water management and food security interventions with immediate social protection measures like cash for work that empowers communities to adapt to climate change impact. So how does this project aim to support climate resilience of vulnerable communities? The first support is improving water access. The project facilitates the construction of small farm reservoir and rehabilitation of water harvesting facilities that captures and store water to prevent that usually address the effects of drought and flooding. Second is enhance food security and livelihood. The binhi component or the seedlings, that we call the seedlings or binhi component, promotes the establishment of communal and urban gardens using sustainable climate resilient farming techniques like that provide supplemental income and dependency on single crops vulnerable to climate shocks. And third is through capacity building. We provide capacity building and empower our beneficiaries to receive training in sustainable farming practices, disaster reduction, and climate change adaptation. And the fourth support that we gave is the providing immediate social protection. The project uses cash for training or cash for work model, providing immediate financial assistance on food packs in exchange of their labor in building and maintaining the climate adaptation infrastructure. For the second concern, the question, what are some of the difficulties that we experience in implementing this law at Binhi? So first is the balance between short-term relief with long-term goals. Social protection often focuses on immediate needs like food, income, while climate adaptation requires long-term planning and investment. So balancing these two is quite difficult. The second challenge is ensuring community ownership and relevance. Water and climate solutions were often top-down and ignored local knowledge. Integrating this effectively requires intensive community engagement and participatory planning to ensure solutions are locally appropriate and sustainable, not just imposed designs. The third the third challenge that we identified is the coordination across sectors. The initiatives requires collaboration among various government agencies like social welfare, agriculture, environment, and science and technology, and local government units, of course. And ensuring seamless coordination and unified approach can be complex also. And last challenge that we experience is measuring integrated impact. It can be challenging to measure the combined impact of a program on both social welfare and climate resilience using a single set of metrics. So, with this challenge, what has been done to address these challenges that we experience in handling lawat binhi? So, first is we have navigated these issues through our holistic community-centric approach. We have the integrated design. This program was designed from the outset to address both issues simultaneously, recognizing that food and water insecurity are often interlinked with climate vulnerability. The same activities provide both immediate income like cash for work and long-term climate resilience like water source and fish production. The second approach that we adopted is the community-driven implementation. The project emphasizes participatory planning. So not just the government, but rather we involve the community and utilizes local knowledge and labor for implementation, which increases community buy-in and ensures the solutions are appropriate for local conditions. The third one is capacity building. The inclusion of mandatory training alongside works assignments help bridge the knowledge gap, ensuring that the skills needed for long-term climate-smart practices remain within the community even after the initial project phase ends. And the last approach that we made is the multi-stakeholder collaboration. The project relies on the whole of society approach, partnering with multiple government agencies, local government units, and local organizations, which helps streamline the delivery of technical assistance and resources and ensure the project sustainability beyond the project rollout. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very clear. And
Okay, thank you.
I think, yeah, a fascinating example. I'm particularly interested in the community-centric approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be great to hear more about that when we get to the Q&A. But if I could now, Nard, turn to you. So you've been involved in several studies on adaptive social protection in the region, including in several Pacific Island states. So I wonder if you could share what aspects of adaptive social protection have been developed in the Pacific region that you can share with us, and what are some of the main gaps that you think need to be addressed?
Great, of course. Now, I'd be happy to share some of these emerging results. So, in a recent study, we looked across the Pacific and then with very detailed case studies in Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Vanuatu to understand a little bit how far countries have come in building their adaptive social protection systems. And also identifying a little bit where the main gaps are. Now, I have to mention that the study is still going through the final steps of validation, so we cannot share it yet, but hopefully it will be out soon. But I can already bring you along through some of the key takeaways. So I want to start with focusing first a little bit on kind of like exploring what's already there. And I think there we see that three things really stand out. First of all, policy recognition is really emerging quite strongly too.
Yes.
The Paris Agreement, but also the NDC processes that countries go through on an annual basis or on a regular basis, they really pushed countries to think much more seriously about resilience and also how social protection features within that. And social protection is really beginning to show up in those conversations. Some countries even reference it directly in, for instance, climate strategy, which is definitely something that's new. And also some regional platforms in the Pacific, like the Pacific Resilience Partnership, they have started, for instance, to acknowledge social protection as part of their toolkits of interventions. But I should really say that it's still in the early days. Because, for instance, when we looked at the 14 Pacific NDCs that were there, only one really explicitly talks to social protection. So yes, it features indirectly, but explicitly social protection features only in one. So policy integration is really just only kind of like starting to emerge. Secondly, I have to, of course, mention that a lot of countries have been really successful, and COVID has been really helpful in that. They've been successful in expanding their social protection systems. And then I really speak to these routine social protection programs. And they've been doing that over the last couple of decades. Many have introduced social pensions, disability benefits, more recently also child grants or targeted family programs. So there is a foundation to build on. But I also should mention that these systems or these programs aren't climate focused by design or shock responsive by design. That needs to be worked on explicitly. But at least they give countries some options to work with, right? And then thirdly, we also see some really interesting innovations that touch on climate resilience. So for instance, you see public works programs that support things like environmental restoration, mangrove restoration, climate smart agriculture initiatives. So there's too many initiatives to name, but you really see exciting innovations also in the Pacific. But as Christy also mentioned, these are often not explicitly framed as social protection, despite having clear linkages with them, and they fit very well in the broader picture of what ISP should do and contribute to. So that's in terms of what we've achieved. Briefly speaking also to what some of the gaps are. The first one is, as I mentioned before, the policy integration is still quite thin. So social protection explicitly rarely features in NDCs or NAPs. And when it does, there's also not really the concrete mechanisms or the costings or the implementation plans to accompany that then high-level commitment as mentioned in these plans. Secondly, we also see that coordination between the various sectors. Christy has beautiful diagrams, social protection, disaster risk reduction, climate change. Coordination between these various sectors is very weak still. And even if we consistently bring them together, often we only consistently bring them together in the emergency response coordination, but not on a routine basis. So that's something we can learn too. I mentioned that coverage has been expanding, but still coverage is too limited, right? So about 4 in every 10 individuals in the Pacific is covered by at least one social protection program. That's far below the global average and also far below what we simply need, right? So, and then within that, certain vulnerable groups are especially left out: children, informal sector workers, and we know that they are especially often vulnerable when shocks hits and also to the effect of climate change. Then second, lastly, operational systems. They're kind of still underdeveloped. They're rapidly developing, but still underdeveloped. We miss social registries or interoperable MISs. Payment mechanisms are also not always shock responsive. On the positive, we see some really exciting early warning systems, which are often community driven. And if we integrate those better with our adaptive programming, that's a real unique feature that ASP in the Pacific could bring to the table. And then lastly, in terms of financing, that's probably the question that keeps us all up at night. But it's growing, but of course it's still inadequate vis-a-vis the very significant task that's ahead of us. There's very substantial financing gaps still present in most countries. On top of that, ASP is often also still a donor-driven agenda to some extent, right? As Christy also mentioned, where projects are not necessarily absorbed by the national budget yet. So just in short, some emerging trends, some exciting emerging trends in the Pacific, but we still need to make significant progress from us to move from kind of like fragmented intervention to a really coherent system that really does justice to the ability that social protection has in the climate change discussion. So over to you.
Thank you, Nard. Very helpful and interesting. I thought the point that you raised about the incorporation of social protection in NDC's nationally determined contributions was a particularly interesting one, and noted that it sounds like in the Pacific perhaps there's further opportunity to be exploited there. On a kind of a slightly more positive note, just for the global agenda, I heard the other day that of the 59 NDCs, the third round that have been submitted at the beginning of this month, 66% of them did mention social protection, which is up from something like 6% in the second round. So that kind of, yeah, momentum is there, which is really, really great to see. Okay, so if I can come back to you now, Ms. Castillo, to hear more from the Philippines. So one of the areas that many countries are looking to develop is their anticipatory assistance programming. The Philippines government has, of course, been absolutely pioneering in this regard, and as Christy briefly mentioned in her initial presentation. So I wonder, what advice would you give to other countries as they think about developing the provisions to be able to assist vulnerable households more effectively when a major shock is forecast but has not yet hit? Over to you. I'm not sure if you're still on mute, but we're not hearing
Hello,
you.
good afternoon again. Yeah, well, a friendly recommendation from the Philippines, especially from the Department of Social Welfare and Development, to effectively assist our vulnerable household before a major shock is to adopt anticipatory action, integrated into adaptive and shock-responsive social protection systems applicable in your respective country through these major provisions. Of course, well, before you can implement anticipatory action, we have to go through these four provisions, four provisions. First is the policy and institutional framework. We have to establish a framework. Like in the Philippines, we have recently approved a national law, Declaration of State of Imminent Disaster Act in the Philippines. So this is where we can already implement anticipatory action. But for now, we're still in the process of developing the implementing rules and regulation. That empowers this policy framework empowers our authorities to act early based on forecasts, enabling a shift from reactive to proactive disaster management. So in this phase, you have to integrate social protection in your planning in every locality. Then define roles and functions of every stakeholders. We have to clearly define roles and responsibilities and ensure strong coordination. We have to emphasize strong coordination mechanisms between national and the local government units, because the local government units are the one implementing these projects. So there must be a strong coordination. Community participation. Foster local preparedness by involving communities, because we cannot have a successful project without the involvement or participation of our community, the people in the community. The second one is we have to have a data and information system. Ensure that early warning systems is in place. We have to develop and invest in effective early warning systems that provide timely and accurate forecasts of impending hazard, because this is our trigger. The forecast-based triggers designed social protection program with established data-driven. That this an early warning system that will automatically activate the release of aid when a certain threshold is reached. So we have to be ready. The system is there, that when there's an impending disaster, it will easily activated. Then the dynamic social registry. So in the information system, we have to have a ready list of our beneficiaries that include real-time data on vulnerabilities and exposure to risk. And of course, the financing mechanism. There must be fund for this intervention. We have to pre-arrange for contingency planning, secure funding in advance through mechanisms like dedicated contingency funds in national budgets. This ensures immediate access to resources without administrative relay, because when there's fund, when you have to activate the anticipatory action, we can easily release the assistance to your target beneficiaries. And of course, you have also to consider flexible funding. Why flexible funding? To ensure that financing is flexible enough to allow for both vertical expansion, meaning there must be an adjustment in the amount that you will be providing to the beneficiaries, and horizontal expansion, the number of your target beneficiaries in response to a crisis, because you cannot really avoid that there is an adjustment in your target and the amount that you will be providing. Then after these three major provisions is already established, of course, you have to identify what programs or interventions that you are going to implement. First is what we are recommending is the anticipatory cash transfer. This provide this program provides cash transfers or vouchers to vulnerable families days or weeks before a shock, enabling them to make their own preparedness choices such as buying food, securing shelters, protecting assets, or evacuating early. So they have to use these funds. Then strengthening livelihoods and assets. Implement programs that build resilience, such as public works program, focus on climate resilience infrastructure like irrigation channels, flood protection walls, or providing agricultural input to support sustainable livelihood. And another one, this is very consistent, is the capacity building. We have to provide targeted training and technical assistance to local government units and at-risk communities to improve their ability to effectively use disaster risk reduction funds and implement local response plans. And lastly, the inclusive design. We have to mainstream gender sensitive and socially inclusive approaches to ensure the specific needs of our vulnerable groups like women, children, persons with disabilities, indigenous people are addressed in planning and during response phase. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I hope, some of those points about inclusivity, I hope we'll have a chance to pick those up in the Q&A. Hanif, if I may turn back to you now. So there's, as we've, seen through Christy's presentation and we've been touching on in the discussion so far, there's clearly many, many aspects of comprehensive adaptive social protection provision. In that broad landscape, what would you say is the priority now for Pakistan to strengthen the climate responsiveness of its social protection system, and how do you think this is going to be best achieved?
Thank you. Hello again. I think for Pakistan, we are making preparation to deal with climate shocks, but I think the climate change is better prepared than us. When we look at past the climate shocks, we faced climate shocks after 10 to 15 years, but in recent years, that frequency has reduced to every 3 to 5 years. And further, the intensity of the climate shocks has increased. For example, in 2022, 1/4 of the country was submerged with flood waters. So we have programs, we have institutions working under federal government, provincial government, but what we face is fragmentation, overlapping of different programs, data. So to deal with it, our Ministry of Poverty Alleviation, has prepared a comprehensive social protection policy framework. It has been approved by the Prime Minister and soon it will be placed before the federal cabinet. The framework, it is based on all domain approach. All the stakeholders have been connected. Natural Disaster Management Authority, Ministry of Climate Change, and Ministry of Finance, our ministry, provincial government. So it will have a comprehensive approach. There will be provincial Poverty Alleviation Coordination Council. There will be some working groups. Working group will work on climate resilience, one group on poverty graduation, sustainable livelihood. So after the implementation of that framework, we will have a integrated approach to deal with the uh, climate shocks through social protections. At program levels, as I mentioned, learning from NPGP we are going to implement another program project with the support of Islamic Development Bank. It will PGEP, Poverty Graduation of Extremely Poor and Disaster Affected Household. It will be implemented in 25 districts, and 70% of the program will be spent on climate adaptation. So 10 districts are from drought-stricken districts of Balochistan. There will be a facility of rainwater harvest, solar tube wells, how to conserve, make better use of water, and then the drought resistance crops, awareness sessions, and wash facilities, kitchen gardening. And for flood affected districts, we are going to implement climate smart technologies. There will be awareness sessions, kits, free fertilizer, quality seeds, a lot of things to small farmers. And the in other 10 districts, beside the poverty graduation through productive asset, interest-free loans, there will be a mechanism of crop insurance. And after learning from NPGP, we have increased the insurance of livestock from 1 year to 3 years. And also we are working on interoperability of data so we can connect all the social protection institutes and agencies under one umbrella so can better use the information to target. BIS programs is also evolving and we are making more interventions, adding more features to BIS to add poverty graduation through skill development. And also there's a mechanism of savings and the beneficiary can save, the government will provide. So these are the measures that will help the government and vulnerable population to deal with climate shocks. The PGP program that we are going to implement will focus more on climate resilient agriculture because the districts we are targeting are based on agriculture. So agriculture is primarily source of livelihood for those communities. So by these interventions, we expect that we will be in better position to make preparation for climate resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. Very ambitious agenda. Sounds like you have your work cut out for you. Thanks for sharing that with us. Okay, Nard, I'm going to turn to you for our last question before we get into the Q&A. So it can be quite overwhelming to think about all of these different areas that need to be addressed to support vulnerable communities with the increasing impacts of climate change, particularly in contexts where social protection systems may be fairly small or nascent to begin with. So what advice, Nard, would you give to those working on adaptive social protection? Firstly, to help them think through the many different priorities, and secondly, to be able to convince others that investing in adaptive social protection is indeed a worthwhile investment.
Yeah, no, it can be very overwhelming because it's, of course, still a relatively new area of work that has been emerging in the last 5 to 10 years. So where to start? Let me refer back to the 3 A's framework that Christy presented of anticipate, absorb, and adapt to actually show that you can start with some really practical minor steps to get the ball the ball moving to get started. So first of all, starting with the anticipate, right? So that's again acting before a crisis hits. And I think for many Pacific countries, for instance, reflecting on the study that I did, this is a great starting point. In that region, there's already really excellent community-based early warning systems. So then the big opportunity is to simply connect that to programmatic responses if they exist, of course. And then on the anticipatory side, we have to, of course, agree on certain parameters prior to the response. And this can be very basic parameters, right? Agree on a trigger. So if, for instance, a typhoon of certain magnitude hits a country, this is what we can, this automatically triggers a response. Agree on who gets support, agree on how it will be paid. And over here, you really can, again, simplify certain things. So don't get overwhelmed. You don't need a national social registry to start doing anticipatory action work. You can use existing beneficiary lists. You can overlap them perhaps with hazard maps. Or you can, as I mentioned before, work with community-based structures to pre-identify certain vulnerable populations that can benefit from support. So again, let's boil it down to what needs to happen, and then I think it's fairly straightforward. In terms of the second aid, the absorb, where we help households, of course, with stand shocks when they also hit. And here the advice then kind of becomes, don't try to build 20 programs from the start. Build one reliable channel that can scale during disasters. And that could, yes, very much be a flagship program, but there can be anything that is predictable and that can extend to some extent during a crisis. And over here, what's interesting, and it's also hopefully something that comes out of the Pacific study as a lesson also for other countries beyond the Pacific, we also can explore whether we can use sometimes the more developed delivery systems that exist in the social insurance and social security sector, and whether we can use these channels, so these delivery channels, also during shocks to deliver government-funded support to newly vulnerable populations. And that's not something that has been done at scale, but that is something that several Pacific Island countries, which have traditionally strong, for instance, provident funds, are exploring. And one case in point is Vanuatu. And then the last A, of course, is the adaptation A. And there I really want to challenge also a little bit the banks, right? The big funders of, for instance, large infrastructure projects. And I think this also is the area of work that often feels huge, it feels abstract, it feels very much long-term, as also Ms. Imee mentioned, while social protection often deals with something that's much more the immediate needs. Over here, we see Pacific Island countries already doing a lot of work. So as I mentioned, environmental restoration projects, climate smart agriculture initiatives, and these ultimately are adaptation programs. And many of these already support vulnerable households. But I think the real opportunity here, and not only in the Pacific, but definitely across the region, and this is where I want to challenge, for instance, ADB, the host of this webinar, but also other banks and other partners, is how we can intentionally weave social protection into climate and adaptation investments that are already happening, rather than, again, treating ASP as something that's completely different. And that includes, for instance, these large infrastructure investment projects, which are financed by development partners like ADBs. And then we can think of ports, roads, coastal defense projects, energy transition or green energy projects. I think they can be designed much more to do much more than just deliver physical assets, right? They can also create targeted jobs for vulnerable groups during both the construction, but also afterwards the maintenance phase. They can be linked to cash for work programs or skills building pathways or vocational training pathways and projects that also often banks are supporting. And they can leave behind very important systems that are helpful for social protection practitioners and programs too, like payment channels, grievance redress mechanisms that can also strengthen the long-term capacity or long-term social protection capacity. So I really hope that also these infrastructure projects can be designed with social protection in mind, and that they don't just build that they don't just build kind of like climate resilient assets, but that they also build climate resilient households and climate resilient communities. And importantly, that is, they have the ability to do so without tapping into new funding streams, but simply using existing funding streams of infrastructure investments smarter and also to a greater benefit of population. So that's the third A, in which I think we can start also by making very practical steps in some of the lending that we do.
Great. Thank you so much, Nard. That's very helpful pointers on how to get started, and an interesting challenge for the MDBs there in terms of integrating social protection in some of the more usefully in some of these bigger climate investments. So we've not got a huge amount of time for the Q&A, so I'm going to move swiftly into that. And I'm going to pick first the question from Jeanne de Pano that's for Ms. Castillo. Thank you for the question. So Ms. Castillo, over to you. I think you can see the question. It's about how you identify beneficiaries in your projects, and also how you coordinate the work with other relevant government agencies. Over to you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for the question. For the first concern, we identify our beneficiaries in collaboration or coordination with the local government units. They're the one who identified the beneficiary that is living belongs to the vulnerable communities, like those in the hazard-prone areas, and those especially the farmers, and of course those with ready to be organized. So that's one of our criteria, ready to be organized and living in disaster-prone areas, and identified, of course, with the local government units because they're the one who is more familiar who are those uh, beneficiaries that is eligible for the program. Then with the second question, and DPWH is member of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council. So we do coordinate with them. We have if they have concerns but for our infrastructure, we don't coordinate with DPWH because our infrastructure is just very community based, a small project, and it's the community who is doing the construction themselves because that's just a very minor infrastructure project. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We also received a question from a participant, Barbara, about the challenge of cross-sectoral coordination, and asking about any practical examples about how that's overcome. So, Imee, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add specifically onto that question, and Hanif, I'll also turn to you to see if there's anything that you wanted to share from the Pakistan context in terms of how you manage the cross-sectoral coordination. Imee, was there anything you would want to add on that part? I'll give you a moment to digest the question, and you can let me know if you want to come back in. Hanif, is there anything that you want to say or could share on the cross-sectoral coordination question that we've received?
Thank you. Yes, cross-sectoral coordination is a big challenge. We have implemented during our floods 2022. We had a coordination mechanism with National Disaster Management Authority, which actually provided data regarding the losses uh, in different categories. And we also mobilize Ministry of Finance through that mechanism to release funds for emergency support. And the Ministry of Climate Change was also in coordinations, and mostly the relief and rescue was done by provincial government. So but we faced a lot of fragmentation, lot of challenges uh, during response to flood 2022. So in my second question, I propose that we, realizing the challenge, we are working on social protection policy framework, which is basically a mechanism of coordinations. So all stakeholders are connected, and all agencies have specific roles, and all have a pre-established coordination mechanism. So in case of any climate shocks, uh, all agencies have predefined roles. So in that way, we can have a better coordinations. So that is a challenge, and we are addressing through that policy framework by putting all stakeholders under one umbrella. Thank you.
Thanks. Very, very interesting. Yeah, that's something that I think we as WFP are also very focused on in our work around adaptive social protection, the system preparedness specifically as it relates to clearly defining ahead of time roles and responsibilities of all the relevant actors, so that you know, when action is required, those things are already clear for everyone, and everyone can get going with their pieces. So thank you for that. Nard, we received a question that I was wondering if I might turn to you for, about the enabling elements that matter for operationalizing adaptive social protection. So it touches a little bit on this coordination issue in terms of the interdepartmental governance arrangements, but also on the interoperability of registries and data sharing, or even joint financing frameworks. I was wondering, Nard, if you wanted to have a go at that one.
Yeah, excellent question. Now, and over here, of course, the responses are infinite, right? Like there's so many areas of progress that we need to achieve progress on for us to really operationalize adaptive social protection effectively and efficiently. However, I think always one great starting point is if we look at the national planning framework, right? Often we ignore the fact that we need to ensure that adaptive social protection needs to feature very specifically within the national planning framework. And then I mean, for instance, national development plans to ensure that also ultimately resources are allocated to the various outcomes within the national development plan that may or may not include adaptive social protection. And we have two very interesting case in points here, and that is both Indonesia and Cambodia, which in recent years have included adaptive social protection explicitly in their national development plan. So then every country typically goes every 5 years through the development of such a plan, which is then linked to, for instance, a medium-term budget and expenditure framework. And the medium-term budget and expenditure framework link and are tightly linked to the objectives that are specified in the National Development Plan. So one way through which one kind of like enabling environment element to ensure that social protection is also becoming more adaptive is to ensure that it's integrated in the highest policy planning documents, because then afterwards we can also trickle that down, for instance, as I mentioned, in medium-term expenditure and budget frameworks, but also simply ministerial budgets, right? Because also ministerial budgets ultimately gets developed to align with the objectives that are specified in these longer-term policy documents. So that entire public financial management and also that entire like governmental planning component is often completely ignored. We've seen, of course, in the past, and referring back again to the Pacific Island country experience, sometimes, for instance, the development of an adaptive social protection policy becomes like is linked to a loan from ADB or World Bank. And then what we see afterwards is that the money is disbursed given that the policy has been approved, but then very little happens in terms of the implementation, given that no government resources are also through its medium-term expenditure and budget framework directed to these sectors. So then it just becomes kind of like a ticking of the box exercise without also materially changing the situation of social protection in a country. So I would always make the case to start at that highest level and to don't ignore the public financial management aspect of driving change when it comes to adaptive social protection. And as I mentioned, very interesting case studies, both Cambodia and Indonesia have recently included ASP as a policy domain in their national planning documents. And as a result, we immediately see that coordination across sectors also becomes more efficient, given that for the first time, all countries or all ministries also have a united policy objective to work towards, and resources start becoming available for adaptive social protection. So yeah, that's a great starting point.
Thanks. I could not agree with you more on the importance of focusing on the financing dimensions. There's so much richness and complexity in what we're talking about from the programmatic solutions perspective, but so much more we could dig into as well on the different financing instruments that have worked and that are needed, and that have potential to scale. Bob, I'm aware in terms of time I need to pass back to you, but I'm wondering if you could allow me to invite Christy to just come off mic very briefly, because there were quite a few excellent presentation, inspired quite a lot of reaction, and I can see she's diligently answering questions. But Christy, I didn't know if there was anything pressing that you also wanted to say before we pass to Bob for closing. Over to you, Christy.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I was trying to type in some answers to some of the excellent questions there, and I see that there's also a question about the current current, the recent floods and the current responses. And I mean, maybe we can have another webinar scheduled to go in specifically into this this late 2025 era of shock responses. But I think the key, one of the key lessons that we see is that although on my presentation I made it sound a bit as though that absorb function is very developed, that we kind of know what we're doing there. That's not the case. Every shock that hits, we learn something. We have to learn something. We have to stay humble as well. These are dire circumstances that populations are facing, and it's one thing to have discussions at this level, to have policies on paper, but it's another thing to make sure that those responses are actually reaching the people who need it the most and in a timely manner. And there's always progress that we can be making on that, and significant progress. So I think being humble in this space about also not biting off more than we can chew. I liked Nard's comments about taking incremental steps. What we hope from the study we've been doing and the outputs that we're putting out, we hope that it can be providing ideas of kind of the cross-system developments that are needed, but definitely building the capacity and building the political will and buy-in to actually implement incremental changes is the key to actually implementing ASP in a way that makes a difference to people's lives in practice. So yes, I think I'll stop on that. But thank you all. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and thanks everyone for your participation.
Thanks so much, Christy. And yet, thank you very much to all of the panelists for your time and for sharing your expertise and experience. I agree, it's been super interesting, and I can think of at least 4 different spin-off webinars we need to plan for. So sorry, there's not more time today. Thanks so much. Over to you, Bob.
Thanks very much, Rosie. And I just wanted to say that I'm leaving this webinar with a sense of reassurance, in a way, how this discussion has highlighted a range of different arrangements that exist in the region, and the scale of ambition and the creativity that many governments have exhibited in developing those arrangements, and a lot of them are context specific. So Christy highlighted a sort of variety of arrangements one can put in place, and what we see is that countries pick arrangements depending on their contextual fit and relevance and so on. So there are a lot of options, and there are lots of various arrangements one can introduce to deal with the shock. And in the Pacific as well, although it's early stages, but we do see growing interest. We see that countries are laying groundwork for supporting adaptive social protection. So I have huge optimism about how this field how adaptive social protection will be strengthened in the years to come. So with this, I would like to thank our panelists, our moderator, and our host at socialprotection.org for this fascinating session. And as well, obviously, I would like to thank our audience joining us online today for their time and engagement. And just to say that our next webinar is planned for February next year. We'll share details near the time, so please stay tuned. Thanks very much, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you, and bye-bye.